Sparkline, Part 1, Static. This video is part 1 of a 2-video series where we build up this interactive Sparkline chart. This part 1 video gets us to this place, where this displays on the screen, but the part 2 video adds this hover interaction. In part 1, Static Sparkline, we will cover preparing the data, the whole Sparkline concept, loading the data with unidirectional data flow, parsing dates with D3 timeParse, transforming JSON data, aggregating daily data to weekly data with D3, loading and using fonts from Google Fonts, and formatting numbers and dates with D3. That lays the groundwork for the part 2 video, Interactive Sparkline, which covers hover interaction with mouse move, bisection to isolate the hovered data point, unidirectional data flow and immutable update patterns, drawing the circle for the hovered point, the text updating on hover, drawing the vertical line for the hovered point, calculating the hovered time interval, and dynamic text based on hover interaction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with preparing the data. Today, I wanted to focus on this NPM line chart reproduction. So let's say you're looking at a package. There's this weekly downloads chart right here. But hey, why not do D3 itself? You know, has what, 2 million or so, 3 million weekly downloads. It's a pretty popular package. So I want to make this visual and also the interaction where when you hover it shows a line and then it updates the date range and the number. Maybe we should start with the data. I like using gist to store little data sets that we can, because we can pull them in. And I'll just do like a readme.md, like this data contains the weekly downloads data for the D3 package. So I'll create this gist. And then what I'm thinking is I'm going to clone this locally and then work on the data, output a CSV, and then upload that CSV back to GitHub gist. And then we can fetch it in the front end, in the VizHub code. So I'm in a terminal now. I'm going to clone this gist and then cd03, whatever this is. And then I'm going to use Vim just because it's fun. And, well, I wonder if there's any tool that gives you this data, like npm. There's something called npm stat. Oh, wow, look at this. So if I say, all right, for D3, let me get it from, well, how far back does it go anyway? A year? So if I hover, you know, right now we're in July 2024. If we go back here, it's July 2023. All right. So let's do July 2023 up until today. Show charts. Okay, this is what? Daily. Oh, interesting. Ah, here's the weekly data. Now, can we get at this data, though? That's the question. I wonder, is it pulling from some kind of a data source? Okay, here's a request that has some, looks like clean JSON data in it, which is great. This appears to be the daily data, though. Well, I wonder, maybe they compute weekly based on the daily, which we could do. All right, so I'm just going to copy that. And then I'll say, okay, data.json, I'm going to paste it in there. Okay, so it's D3 and it's got keys and values. That's all right, yeah, we can work with that. And then I'll just make a commit to add this. Add JSON data for downloads, and then just push it. Okay, and then if we refresh this gist, we have data.json. All right, sweet. That's how, you know, that's one way you can get the data for this. Now let's visualize this with D3. So I'm going to go to raw here to get this raw URL that I could pull from in the front end code. And then I'll go over to VizHub and fork this circles with D3 example. I'll call it interactive line chart, or maybe interactive tiny line chart, because, like, you know what it really is? It's an interactive sparkline. The sparkline concept, this term sparkline means like little lines that are not full visualizations, but they just give sort of an essential view of it. Okay, interactive sparkline, that's what I'll call it. And then in the code here, we want to load some data. I'm going to comment out all the rendering stuff for now, except maybe the SVG, because we're going to need that. And then I'll say const data equals, and then let's make a function, I guess. Get data. It's time to load the data with unidirectional data flow. And the way that this will work is it's going to use unidirectional data flow, which is a pattern that I've set up here in VizHop that works well with hot reloading. And to do that, we can set it up so that getData is a function that maybe returns null if the data is not loaded yet, but it should return instantly. And then we can say if no data, return early and don't do any of the other stuff. And then we can say import getData from /getData, which is a file that I haven't made yet, but I'll make a new file called getData.js. And this will export const getData equals function. And this function should fetch the following URL. And I'll just paste the URL from the gist. This one here. And then I'll say fetch. Right. Then. There we go. Okay. So that should be fetching the data. And it does. We get an object with D3 and the time series. Okay, sweet. So the code that the AI wrote was fetch URL.then, because the fetch returns a promise, response, and then response.json, which is another async thing that parses the JSON out of the text. And then once we get the data, it says console.log data. And if there's an error, it will log the error out. Okay, so what we want to do here is when we get this data, we want to store that in our state. So I want to call a function called setState, and that the API of this is it takes as input the previous state and returns the new state based on that previous state. So this is immutable update patterns. So I will use whatever's on the previous state, but then also put data on the state. The only problem now is we don't have access to setState, so let's pass that in as an argument or as an option. I like this options object pattern. So now we just need to pass this in from index.js. And index.js in turn actually gets access to state and setState out here. And we can just pass both of these into getData, actually. We're going to need both of these. Because after we call setState, it'll be there on the state. And we only want to fetch if there is no data, or rather if it's not loading. So if state.data is undefined, that's when we want to fetch. I'll move that URL out. Okay, and then otherwise, well, actually, we don't need the else, because in this case, we're going to return null, like I said earlier, to indicate, okay, the data's loading. Don't worry about it. And then, if it is already there, then we return state.data. And now, all of this should work, in theory. So let me just test that by saying console.log data. All right, so we have our data. And this is the format that it's in. It's in an object with D3 and a bunch of key value pairs where the key is this formatted date and the value is this number. So I want to get this into a different format that we can use with D3, namely an array of objects where each object has the date as a field and then the number as another field. And these should be JavaScript dates. So let's transform this data. I'll say, all right, let's make a thing called parsed data. And this we can derive by mapping over data.d3, or rather the object.keys of that. So object.keys is a function that just gives us all the keys of the objects. So now we can map over these with .map. And the key will be made available to us. And I'll just make a note, this is one example value for key. And we want to parse this string into a date. We got to parse these dates with D3 timeParse. To do that, we can use D3 timeParse. So let's assume we have timeParse, which we can import from D3. And we're going to use this to create a function to parse this date. And I'll call it parseDate. And this is going to be timeParse, and we pass in a specifier for this date. And I don't know off the top of my head what that is, but let me give the AI assistant a shot. Might be able to figure that out. Yeah, that looks generally right. Year, month, day. Yes. Thank you, Mr. AI. And then we could say const date equals parse date of key. And that should get us JavaScript dates. So I'll just return that so that we can see in our console.log what the value is for date. And sure enough, it looks like JavaScript dates. Yep, they all have prototypes for JavaScript date. Excellent, excellent. Now we need to parse the values. And the values are just numbers. And they're already parsed as numbers because that's how they came through in the JSON. All right, we need to transform this JSON data. So I think we just need to return a row object that has date as one field and then a value. Or I guess, we could be a little more specific, like num downloads. And that's going to be data.d3 at the key. All right, that should work. Okay, sweet. Now we have an array of objects, each of which has a date property, which is a JavaScript date object, and then num downloads, which is a number. Okay, fantastic. Now we're finally in a position to generate a line for our line chart. But first, let me clean this up a little bit. Parse date does not need to be defined for each row. Let's define that outside. And that could even be outside the function because it's pretty much a constant. And then, this could even be simplified a little bit more. Date is that. And then we could use the more concise syntax with the parentheses around our object. Oh, I'm missing a comma. There we go. That's just a little bit cleaner. All right, so now that we have parsed data, we can render this line. And for lines, we're going to use SVG paths. And we need to set the D attribute based on some kind of a line generator. And this line generator from D3, it'll be a function that takes as input an array. And so for data, let me actually make this an array that contains a single element, which is the data, our one time series. It's set up like this so that if you had multiple time series, you could visualize them as multiple lines. But we just have one line. And we don't need CY or R. And I'll just set the fill to be black. Or, it's going to be lines, so, we need the stroke to be defined. All right, so let's make our line generator. And we're going to use line from D3, which is part of the D3 shape package. And let's see what the AI comes up with, because it's pretty straightforward. Okay, that looks fairly good. So we create a line generator by calling this function, which is pretty much a constructor. And then we specify these accessors for x and y. Now the problem with this code is it doesn't project it into pixel coordinates, so we need x scale and y scale to project these into pixel space. And one of these is going to be a scale time, because we're working with dates. And then the other is going to be a linear scale, because the number of downloads is a quantity that we just want to map linearly to screen coordinates. Scale linear. And both of these we need to import from D3. Okay, we've imported scale time and scale linear from D3. Now we need to set these up. And before we do that, we need to define our margin. We need a margin first because that will inform our scales. Unless we want the line to go all the way to the edge, which we don't. So I'll set the top margin to be 10, and I'll just fill in all the various parts of the margin, top, right, bottom, left. And we can tweak those later. So now, with scale time, we set the domain to be, well, it should be the min and max dates, right? And so let's see if the AI can do that. Yeah, D3 min and max, but really what I want to do is use extent, because D3.extent will compute the min and the max and return it as an array, which we can pass directly into .domain. Now we just need to import extent from D3. Okay, so that's the domain, and then the range will be to do with the margins and also the width and height. And so this looks about right. For the X scale, the range will go from margin left to width minus margin right. But width, let me pull this out into a nice variable called width. And I'll define that right up here. Const width equals container.client width. And that's what we can use for the width value of our SVG. And then the same for height. And this is container.client height. So now we have width and height available for our scales. Okay, that looks about right for the X scale. For the Y scale, it'll be pretty similar. And the AI suggested that the domain is the extent of the number of downloads, which I think it is. I think that's what it is in the NPM downloads. Although maybe it goes from 0 to the max. I don't know. But the range looks right. It's height minus margin.bottom to margin.top. Okay, now we should be able to actually see some data coming through. Let's see if there's any errors. No, I don't see any. So we have this array. Is there anything in our DOM? We have a path with no D attribute. It's kind of weird. Yeah, this is probably null because data refers to the original JSON data, but we need to use parsed data instead. So let me just put that here. And we get something to show up. Amazing. Look at that. Okay, well, this thing basically works, but we don't want the fill. That the default fill of black is causing some problems there, so let me set the fill to be none. Now we get this line. However, this is daily data, but what we want is the weekly data, right? Ideally, there would be like an API that gives us that data, but we are currently working with the daily data instead. Now we're on to aggregating daily data to weekly data with D3. So my question is, how would we aggregate this? If we have data for every day and we want data for every week, I guess we would add them, right? Use the sum aggregation operator. So let me solve that problem first before we work on the interaction. And instead of parsed data, I'm going to call this daily data, just so it's a clear contrast to weekly data. And this is where the AI could really be useful. Let's see what this AI sys could do here. What do you got? Daily data.reduce. This is insane. Okay, so it's reducing and checking for every 7 days, and then it's doing the sum. I feel like this is a pretty long-winded way to do it because D3 has utilities for aggregation. There's D3 group and D3 rollup. And then there's also D3 time, which will tell us which week a day is in. Yeah, there's time interval. So what I'm thinking is we figure out which week each day is in, and then we aggregate based on that with the nice D3 utilities. So there's time week. It says here time week is an alias for time Sunday, which is weird, but 7 days. Okay, so let me try this. Let me try pulling in. Yeah, I don't trust this code. It's too long-winded. I mean, it probably works, but let's use D3 instead. All right, so const weekly data is, well, I want to use D3 group on a field of daily data, which is, I suppose, week. And week will be, I think, time week dot floor of date, which is over here. Ooh, I need to get access to date like this. So let me move it back to that other format with the explicit return. All right, so now date is parse date, and we can pass it into time week dot floor, and we need to import time week from D3. There's some kind of a syntax error. What is it? Where's that error? Oh, weekly data equals nothing. There we go. Okay, now it's prettified. And we should have week. Let me just see if that worked. Console.log daily data. And there's some downstream errors, but it doesn't matter. All right, week is the Sunday. Look at that. Okay, excellent, excellent. This is how you can use d3.week or time week .floor to pass in a date, and it will take that interval of that week and sort of round it to the nearest week. So it'll go back to the previous the Sunday that is most close to this date, but in the past. And this is the input to our aggregation. So now let's do the aggregation. And for that, we can use D3 group, where we just pass in the data, and it gives us some kind of a grouped aggregation. However, I think what we really want is rollup, or flat rollup, to be precise, because it gives you nice arrays as output. Here's how flat rollup works. It aggregates data. So in this case, we got a bunch of penguins. This is the observable example by Phil. Shout out to Phil. Amazing work. Now, the first argument to flat rollup is the data, which is an array of things. And then the second argument is the function that computes the aggregation on this thing they call it V here, which is the subset of the original array that matches one particular group. And the grouping is all these other arguments. So in this case, they're actually using 3 different things. So for every unique combination of species, island, and sex, which is gender, it's producing an output row. So we're going to do something very similar, but we're just going to aggregate by week. So I'll copy this example, stash it in a comment, and then I'll import flat rollup from D3. And now I think I have everything I need to say, okay, weekly data is flat rollup of the daily data, aggregated by sum, not count. This one actually aggregates by count. But how do we sum this together? TBD. Let's just do count for now. Get it to work. And then the group by, so to speak, will be week. All right, let's see, what does this get us? And I'll just leave a to-do, sum this, not count. But did this even work? Daily data. Or sorry, weekly data. Let's console.log the weekly data. I think it worked. So yeah, it worked. And there are 7. The count is always 7. Well, that makes sense because there's 7 days in a week. And we should probably reformat this to be objects instead of arrays. But first, let's get the sum going. And that's going to be sum. How do we do sum? There must be a pretty easy way. Isn't there like an array utility? I feel like there should be a d3 sum or array.sum. Okay, great. Hey, there it is, d3.sum. You can just pass an array into d3.sum. Who knew? Nice. You got it. You got it. Thank you, GC. And we just got pass in V there. There you go. And I got the import. I'll grab that sum, import it from D3, and let's run this and see. And you know, there's all these downstream errors, so I'll just return here's just so we don't have to look at that. All right, let's see what we got. All right, it's all 0. Oh, you know what? V is not an array of numbers. V is the original array of rows. And sum takes as input a second argument, which is the accessor. So I believe we need to use, yeah, you got it, v dot, or d, d goes to d dot num downloads, I think it was called. Yeah, num downloads. Oh, nice, you ran it, and it worked. I think it worked. Yes, 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 look at this. This is great. Yeah, this is looking great. This is looking great. I think what I want to do now is just map over it and format it like this, where we have an array of objects, where each object has num downloads and week. Or date, rather. Date. So to do that, I'll just map over these and return an object that has num downloads and date. Or we could say week. I guess week is fine. And you know, D here is an array of 2 elements, so we could actually just destructure those 2 elements and name them here. So now we have an array of, you know, this could have come straight out of this could have come straight out of an API that gives you weekly data. So it's relatively clean. Now it's an array of objects, each of which has num downloads. Oop, that's the date. Just got to reverse these. Week should be, okay, num downloads is a number, and week is the date. Excellent, excellent. Okay, now let's visualize this, and that'll get us one step closer. Okay, so we use the weekly data, passing that into the extent and the path stuff. And if I run this, we should see, oh, I have to change this to week, not date. And actually, you know what? I really like to just set up things called X value and Y value, so that if we change one of the field names, like we changed date to week, then we just have to modify it in one place, not multiple places. And so X value will be a function that takes as input D and returns D.week. And then we can use that here and here. X value of D. Yeah, this is better. Now we just have to change it in one spot if we ever need to change it. And then D for the Y value goes to D.num downloads. And then we can use Y value here and also over here. Yeah, I feel like this cleans up nicely. And there it is. There is our line. Hooray! Now, it looks kind of like the original from NPM, but it's got like zeros for the start and end, I guess. I would say we can just not look at the first and last rows, and I'll call it filtered data. How would that look? Yeah, weekly data.slice. And we could just tack on that .slice over here, and we wouldn't need another variable. Okay, that looks better. That looks more similar to this one over here. However, you know what? When I see this, I realize it's not actually based on the extent. The Y scale is not based on the extent because it doesn't go all the way down to the bottom. Maybe it's actually a 0 baseline line chart, and it's actually an area chart. So, yeah. If it's an area chart, it's kind of like a bar chart where I kind of feel like it should be a 0 baseline, not based on the extent. So let me fix that. The Y scale does not have a 0 baseline. It's using extent. But instead, to make this have a 0 baseline, I would say the domain starts at 0, and so the bottom of it is representing the number 0, and then it goes up to the max across this stuff. And we're going to have to import max from D3. Okay. That looks good. That looks pretty similar to this here. Maybe let's just copy these colors now, Make it look exactly the same. Oh, right. So let's get this purple. I want to make our line chart look exactly like this line chart, or area chart, rather. And to get colors, I like to use GIMP. Yeah, so now we can zoom in and get these colors with this color picker. Okay, so let me define some brand colors, and let's call these dark. And there we go, we get our little VisHub color picker if you wanted to change it. And then light for the background. So I'll just pick that color there, grab that, put a hash in front of it, and there's our brand colors. And I'll just make a comment, colors for the area chart. Okay, so let me make this line that color. All right, so over here for our path, the stroke, which is the filled in line, will be brand colors.dark. So now we get a purple line, and fill will be none. Now this is the line. I think what we're going to have to do to get it to be the same as this is to make actually two separate SVG paths. One for the line on the top, and then another one for the filled in area. And D3 is really good at this sort of thing. And it's going to be nearly exactly the same as this, but instead of line, we will be using area from D3, which is also from the D3 shape package. I'll import that. And then we just need to rename our variables. So I'll call this area generator, and I'll use this as the D attribute of this one over here. And let's put the fill to be brand colors.light, and the stroke should be none. Oh, you know what I think is happening is it's clobbering the other path because we need to disambiguate these two somehow, and we could use a class to do that. So we could set the attribute of class, but here's a fun fact. There's also another method called classed. So selection.classed, names and value. So this is good for when you have a bunch of existing class names and you want to sort of surgically add and remove. And I've seen some people use this as the go-to style for setting classes, and it works just as well as the .ettr. It's just a little more classy. So I'll say classed, I'll call this line. And then we can say select all path.line to be clear what we're dealing with. And this unlocks having multiple paths that have different classes that are fed by different things. So I'll give the second one a class of area. And you got it, GC path.area. There we go. There we go. That's exactly right. Now, there appears to be something wrong with our area generator. I feel like the API is a bit different. It has like X1 and Y1. Let me just search for the docs. Yeah, area. So there's Y, but there's also Y0 and Y1. Okay, so I think we may need to specify Y1 and Y0. Yeah, so Y1, let me say Y1, Y0, or Y0, Y1. And I suppose one of these is supposed to be Y scale of 0. There we go, there we go, there it is, there it is. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now we have it showing up. Now let's get the style to be exactly the same. Over here, there's some thickness to this line. And let's get our line to be a little thicker as well. And for that, we can specify stroke dash width. And this can be, I don't know, 5. And with VizHub and the hot reloading, you can alt drag and try different numbers. Hey, that's kind of interesting how it goes outward. Oh, you know what? It's because of the ordering in the DOM. Yeah, the line, okay, I want the line actually to be on top of that area. So let me move this down so that we draw the area first and then we draw the line. So now the line should be on top. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what the line looks like if we tweak the thickness of it. So that's pretty good. That's pretty close to the NPM look. Let me just tweak the margins to get it to be a small thing, because remember, we're trying to make it a tiny little Sparkline, a small representation. But we're going for something like this. So let me set up the margins in such a way that that appears on the right side to make room for this number. We're going to put this number in there too. So I'll put it over to the left side by just tweaking these margins. Yeah, that's looking pretty close. That's looking pretty similar. So now we can either add the interactivity, the hovering interactions, or add the number. Now I'm curious, what is the number in NPM if we don't hover? It's just, I guess, the most recent number, and it says weekly downloads. So we could just do that. Yeah, let's do that first. So let's render a text element. Okay, the AI got us to a place where there's a little bit of text, which is cool, but it's not using the right pattern. This will append a new text element every time, so let's do, and actually is SVG what we want? Yeah, that's all right. Let's just put it straight onto the SVG. Let's do svg.selectAllText.data null.join text. That's better. And then since we are pretty much prototyping, I'm just going to hard code these and tweak them to be approximately right. And with the hot reloading, I can actually do that. And then let's set the font size to be something like 30 pixels. And now we can tweak that. And we could even go so far as figuring out what the font is and getting the color, because I don't think that's black. Yeah, here's the designer in me wanting to get the exact color of the text. Let's get it. Now, what color is that text? It's all threes. So I'll put that in my brand colors as text. And then down, when we define our text element, we can say .attr fill is going to be brand colors text. Okay, it's a slightly gray. And then what is this font? We can inspect element and go over to styles and say font family. There it is. It's Source Sans Pro. Source Sans Pro. Is that a paid font, I wonder? Let's figure out how to load and use fonts from Google Fonts. Well, there's Source Sans 3, which I guess is the same from Google Fonts. Okay, sweet. Well, let's pull in this one. We can say get font, and then get embed code, and then I like to use the import version of this, because then we can go over here and make a new CSS file. I'll make a file styles.css and just paste that in there. And then we can say all of our text, our SVG text elements, get the font family of, we set it here like this, font family Source Sans 3. So I'll paste that in there, and it falls back to the system sans serif font in case it's not there. But now all we need to do is import that CSS. Import /styles.css, and now we get the text in a different font. Hooray! All right, so we need to put a number in this text. You want to give it a shot? I can try out this auto follow feature, which should follow your cursor if you move around. So we have to get the maximum date, which is going to be the last element in the array, and then use that value as our text. So I will take the weekly data, and instead of text to display, well, actually I kind of like that. I'm going to make a variable called text to display. This kind of decouples the rendering from the calculation. And then we can say, all right, our text to display is going to be weekly data at index weekly data dot length dot, well, no, hold on. We have the y value, right? So we could just say y value of that datum. Oh yeah, -1. Thank you. Good call. Good catch. Yes, there it is. Hooray, we got our number. This is how we format numbers and dates with D3. Now, let's put the commas there. I mean, it's not formatted properly. And for that, we can use another utility from D3, which is format. And I'll say const format comma is format of a specifier. And I think if I just put comma, it'll do the right thing. So this is a number formatting utility that takes a domain-specific language string to specify the format. And I think if you just put comma, it'll put commas in between the thousands. Let's find out. So we can just pass this through the format comma function, and we get commas. There it is. All right. That's how you can use D3 format to add commas between your thousands. Okay, now for the truly fun part, which is adding this interaction. Let's add the interaction that NPM has. Just to quickly review what that is, if you go to an NPM package, you can hover like this. All right, that concludes Sparkline Part 1, Static. Please watch Part 2. See you later.